So, for the past few months, I've been working on a secret project for my wife's 30th birthday. I had the ambitious goal of making a game that combined many of her favorite things. Farming games, One Piece, witchy vibes, and Eurovision. I had 2 months, and I had to try and keep it a secret from her. The short version, I made a game. It had farming, the ability to customize outfits using dyes, the ability to make new dyes from crops and flowers found in the wild, and after an in-game week, you hosted a 5 a.m. Eurovision party with the 2 other people on the island, and it says, "Happy birthday! Thank you for playing!" It definitely had bugs. There was a lot of incomplete parts, especially to do with the crafting, dialogue, the number of crops. I think I only had 5. Everything works surprisingly well. So, breaking it down into the major features, there's plants, found both in nature and ones grown from seeds which need watering and time to grow. Individual items such as seeds, the final crops, dyes, clothes, farming tools. Inventory management, moving things around. Crafting, combining different items, crops and flowers into new dyes. Dialogue, simple text with multiple choice and the ability to trigger a store. Equipping different clothes and changing the visuals of those clothes. Buying and selling items. Saving and loading. And a very rudimentary cutscene system for the intro cutscene and for the final cutscene. I could probably ramble for a long time about each of these topics, but for now I will try and focus on just the parts that were more unique. So I'd seen a post by a Reddit user called Quaternius. They had generously posted a lot of free Creative Commons assets, including modular male and female meshes. These meshes had a person split into 4 major parts: the head and hair, torso and arms, legs, feet and shoes. Each mesh already had a single color assigned to a particular material, which meant that, potentially, each mesh had multiple materials. This meant that changing one color on one of these meshes was very easy to do in Unity via code. This made it quite easy to create an outfit system using these meshes as a basis. As I knew that I wanted to be able to update individual colors easily, I created a class to represent changing one material's set of values. I created a class called Shader Visuals that contained a list of color and float values that can be applied to a particular material. And each of these fields had the property names such as _color or _glossiness and the value to set them to. This class also included the display name for what this was going to affect. The pants, the trim, the accessories, all of that. I was also then able to create the dyes using this system, where a single dye would have what the shader values were for that dye. So now I have a class that allows me to define what the colors should be, or in the shininess or anything else, and then have it that a dye also uses the same system and can replace one of those values. The next major problem was item icons for the inventory. At this time I had kept all the item icons as just textures. I thought about using a render texture and updating them all at runtime for the outfits. However, I assumed that the amount of work required for having a separate off-screen humanoid model that was in the correct pose and changing what the camera should be depending on which item needs to be updated could be quite tricky. It may have worked, we'll never know. Instead, I created a shader for colorizing individual textures. I already had the outfits opened in Blender, and I was able to go through and create an A pose for the top body, set the skin to be transparent, make sure that double-sided rendering was happening, and then all I had to do was position a few different cameras for the top body, for hair, for pants, shorts were separate, and feet. So in Blender, I created a bunch of renders of each clothing item using a bit of Python and set each major material to be a specific color of either red, green, or blue. Then in the shader, I could colorize each individual channel to have it line up with what the current shader visual for that part of clothing should be. One of the tricky parts was handling anti-aliasing. Along the boundaries between colors, there seemed to be some final brightness issue for certain color combinations. So ultimately, I rendered the icons at double the resolution with anti-aliasing off, and then scaled down the result in Unity after the shader had done its work. The system as a whole did work, but required a lot of manual updating across many things, between making sure that the color channel for the item icon preview was matched up to the correct material name and all of that. Crafting was done using simple recipes. Each recipe had a list of items or crafting groups. A crafting group was just an enum that could be set onto an item. So for example, making purple dye needs anything that is marked as purple. Making light purple dye needs anything purple and white. So purple dye is already marked as purple, so you can reuse a purple dye and white flowers to make light purple, or you can still use purple flowers and white flowers. It was a bit abstract. I had anything that was marked shiny and yellow could make gold dye, so corn and a gemstone made gold, which doesn't really make sense, but I was working with the items I had. One of the flaws of the system is that the same set of items could match up to multiple recipes. I deliberately made it so that in the final game this didn't happen, but I did have the idea that it could randomly choose one of the things and you would just have to keep trying, but that also, I don't really like using RNG too much either. I found it tricky to find a good pre-made asset for modular building pieces that can work inside and outside. So I went to Blender and I made use of some non-destructive modeling, where I created the basic shape of what I wanted and then used a series of modifiers to get the final mesh. Generally, all the meshes use the following modifiers: a bevel, a subdivision, a displacement using a noise texture with coordinates set to global, which is important, and a decimate. By adjusting any of these values, I can make each piece more or less rough with more or fewer triangles. By having the displacement coordinates set to global, it meant that I could very quickly make variants simply by duplicating the mesh and moving it, which would change where the noise was, which would change the displacement, which would ultimately change the overall final shape. I also wanted to keep the texturing simple and flexible, so I made use of some gradients to define what the actual color was for each building part. This meant that I could create multiple variants of each building piece just by changing what the gradient was for that piece's material. And I decided to do this using just one texture. So I took my texture, I split it into 32 slices and put a gradient on each slice. I was able to put in things for natural woods, painted woods, tiles, metals, stones, all of that. Then I created a shader that would make use of all this. So the x coordinates or the u coordinate in the UVs would be maintained and indicate how much along the gradient that we wanted. Usually was much more of a how much of a gradient did we want, sort of more the width overall for the texture. And then the shader itself would control the v coordinate or the y value in the texture. And then that way I could say, here is this wood and it's at y coordinate, let's say 3. But then dark wood be at y coordinate 4. I used a custom inspector to allow me to set it using integers, but then it was turned into a proper float value for simplicity in the shader. Ultimately, I only made 3 buildings, but putting them together was fairly simple. And having a nice variety for the woodboard, flooring, and for different poles, and for windows frames, and all of that, making it not look too repeating was very nice. Some of the things that I learned, having to go through and actually try to produce all of this in a short amount of time, was 3D rigged animation. I'd never done any of that. It was good to learn a little bit around how vertex groups can be tied to bone names, and bone names can be tied to a humanoid avatar. Using some sort of standard bone setup allowed use between different animations. At least I think that's how it works. I could be wrong, but that seemed to be how it goes. I learned that the drag and drop system in Unity is very useful. It felt a little complex with all the different interfaces you could implement, but ultimately, I know that building a drag and drop system is always quite tricky, so having something that worked out of the box was very useful. I learned that using pre-made assets speeds things up a lot, especially with prototyping. I've acquired quite a few Unity assets over the years, and being able to pull in a pretty good character controller, weather system, a whole bunch of decent looking low poly like trees and other assets meant I had a pretty good way of moving around the terrain in a short amount of time, including the UI as well. Whilst things didn't really mesh very well, certainly not for like a commercial game, all the assets have a slightly different feel to them. In terms of prototyping something and putting together stuff, I had something that looked not too dissimilar within the first week or two of working on this, which was kind of amazing. Overall, I'm quite happy with the result. I'm proud of how much I was able to get done within 2 months when I had to keep it a secret and I wasn't working on it full time or anything. Still had to, had my regular job. Yeah, it was a good project to have that forced me to sort of just go, I have to, it was very ambitious. I had goals for like quest lines and like 5 or 6 characters that you could interact with, multiple endings. All things that I knew at the start were way too ambitious, but I kind of wanted to get a feel for the game first and what I was going to make. I didn't have customizing as a major feature to begin with because I was not worrying about that too much. I was just sort of going, I'm going to copy a Harvest Moon / Stardew Valley-esque game just to begin with, like not having to come up with my own game design speed things up a lot as well. But I realized that I did want it to be at least a little bit different, and I had to tie it into Eurovision somehow. And for my wife's birthday, it was Eurovision themed, and we had to make our own outfits for it. So that kind of ended up tying together very well and was really the main motivation to be like, this is what we're building it towards. I also struggled for a long time with the fact that farming games are usually long running. You would play it for like a year or 2 at least in game, if not like 5-6 years in game, which would take you probably at least a few weeks of playing the game. And I was like, there's no way I can make enough content in that amount of time. Also, it doesn't necessarily make sense as a birthday game either, which should be fairly short. So yeah, bringing it all the way back to you only play for 7 in-game days, making it that each day is only 12 minutes a day, plus you can go to sleep, so probably only spending like 3 or 4 minutes a day, which means the whole game only lasted like 15-20 minutes. And it was much more about exploration than anything, because there wasn't that much other content. But yeah, it was good, learnt a lot. I'm hoping to replace all the paid assets with some either open source assets or some of my own, and then put the game out, just here's a public repo on GitHub or something. I'm not expecting people to necessarily run with it as a let's make an open source version of a whole game, but more as a, hey, if you want some idea of how I made this, you can actually see the code and see the assets and how it's tied together. Not that I'm a professional or anything, but I kind of feel like it should have a bit more of a life outside of what I've put together. Anyway, I've ultimately created something where I could put in a lot more content, and I'm trying to debate whether I keep adding in more content or do I leave it at this point and go back to my space game, because I've also had 2 to 3 months now of trying not to think about it, but still ultimately thinking about my space game and going, no, I can't get distracted. I can't work on 2 games at the same time. I can barely work on 1 game at the same time. So, yeah. Still figuring out where I'm going to go, but I want to wrap this up, release an open source version. There's a lot of aspects that I kind of glossed over. I just wanted this video to be a high level overview of what I've done. But if there's anything that someone would want to hear more details about, I'd be happy to make a video on that one topic. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.